All right. Ashenim Dank. Thank you all for coming. Thank you, Judy, for hosting. I'm going to share my PowerPoint here. So my name is Asya Vaisman Schulman, and I am the director of the Yiddish Language Institute at the Yiddish Book Center in Amherst, Massachusetts, although I'm coming to you live from Montreal, snowy, very snowy Montreal. And my presentation today is called In Eynem, Fashioning Yiddishland in the 21st Century Classroom. So the field of Yiddish pedagogy has a long and rich history, with textbooks dating as far back as the 18th century and spanning a wide geographic area. And here you see just a few samples. In the top row, we have some of the older textbooks. And in the bottom row, we have two of the most widely used textbooks in North America, Uriel Weinreich's 1946 College Yiddish, and Sheva Zucker's Yiddish, An Introduction to the Language, Literature, and Culture. And the newest link in this golden decade of Yiddish learning materials is In Eynem, published by the Yiddish Book Center in 2020, which I wrote with my co-author, Jordan Brown, and contributing author, Michal Yashinsky. The book was an enormous 8-year project made possible by the efforts of an entire shtetl worth of contributors and editors, whom you can see listed here. And among them, my mother, Shura Vaisman, who worked on the rich and colorful illustrations along with my uncle, Alexander Vaisman. And as you know, this conference is dedicated to her memory, and I'm pleased to be able to share with you some of the work we collaborated on together. So let's start by talking about why I helped create a new Yiddish textbook. When working on these materials, we had a few goals in mind. We wanted to create materials that would allow us to teach communicatively. So what that means is to enable meaningful, contextualized interactions between students in an environment that supports lowering student anxiety and increasing motivation. Basically, creating materials that make learning fun so that students are comfortable and engaged. We wanted to have materials that supported different types of learners. That includes visual, auditory, and kinesthetic learners, and multiple learning contexts, such as in-class, traditional in-class learning, independent learning, community groups, and online classes. We wanted materials that emphasized all 4 areas of language learning, which are reading, listening, speaking, and writing, and a cultural component that represents both historical Yiddishland with multimedia resources, archival documents, and literary texts, as well as today's Yiddish world with recurring characters representing people who actually study and speak Yiddish today. And I will show you how we achieved these goals with a few exercises from one section of the book. So to contextualize, I'll just mention that the book is organized into 6 thematic units that interweave vocabulary, grammar, and culture in real-life contexts. The 6 themes are getting acquainted, which includes greetings, introductions, common daily activities, the classroom, including describing your space, classroom activities, and studies, family, which is family vocabulary, professions, and describing the physical appearance of people, around the table, which includes food, setting the table, and arranging furniture, out on the town, which is places and activities in town and describing the past, and plans and vacations, which is preparing for a future vacation, clothing, weather, and transport. So we will be looking at a section within Unit 3 that deals specifically with professions. So as you see here, this is a section opener from the textbook. Core vocabulary and structures are taught through illustrations in order to establish a direct link between the Yiddish word and its meaning without the intermediary of English or another language. So here we're learning different profession words. We have bibliothekarin, kremer, kassier, and illustrations of people practicing each of those professions. The illustrations feature a cast of recurring characters, many of whom you see here, who represent today's Yiddish speakers and learners. With these characters, we try to reflect the vibrancy and diversity of the Yiddish world in the 21st century. And we have Jewish characters, including both secular and observant, non-Jewish characters from different countries and different backgrounds, and a variety of identities, including gender, race, and ethnicity. So even here, you see students studying Yiddish in a Yiddish class, members of a Hasidic family, members of a secular Yiddishist family, actors, musicians, former Hasidim, Soviet immigrants, retirees in Florida, and many more. So new vocabulary is always presented in the context of language the student is already familiar with to increase their comfort and confidence so that they can tackle the challenge of newer words more easily. So for example, by this point, students already know how to introduce themselves, how to say what their name is and where they live. So before introducing the new vocabulary, the teacher describes the characters that you see in this illustration by using that language that they already know. So for example, das ist Cyril, ja, sie heißt Cyril, und sie wohnt in Florida. This is Cyril, she lives in Florida. You kind of warming up the students with things they can already understand. And then you build on that by adding in the new information. Cyril is a bibliothekarin. Sie arbeitet mit Bücher. Again, they already know the word Bücher, books. So we are starting to learn that a bibliothekarin is a Mensch, was arbeitet mit Bücher, and so on and so forth. So in class, the teacher is guided in making this presentation by following a detailed lesson plan that's provided in a teacher guide that accompanies the book. But to accommodate independent learners, we offer additional interactive study resources on the website that goes along with the textbook. So I'll show you an example. The same exercise that we just saw an image of from the print book appears as an interactive image on the textbook website. So now we have these same illustrations, but this time only the name of the character is labeled. The word itself is not labeled, so that you can sort of test yourself and see if you remember the word. And I remembered Cyril is a bibliothekarin, so I can click on her. Oh, I was right, bibliothekarin. And also for the auditory learners, you can hear each word being pronounced by a native Yiddish speaker. We were very fortunate to have Paula Teitelbaum, a native Yiddish speaker, record much of the audio for the book, so we can listen.
Die Bibliothekherren, die Schneidern,
and so forth. You can hear each of these words pronounced. There are also flashcards where you can see the image of the word on one side and the Yiddish word on the other side, and that way you can also test yourself and see if you remember the vocabulary. So once the students have become familiar with the new vocabulary, they expand what they can say on this topic by learning the actions or verbs that are associated with various professions. And in this illustration, you can see examples of that. So we learned a Fotografin, ja, Fotografin fotografiert, a Bäcker backt, a Schneider näht. So this way, you're able to say a little bit more on this topic that you are learning about. And this enables the students to have more meaningful interactions with each other around the topic of professions. And there's a gradual progression from passive reception to active production. As you can see in the instructions here, these words are still fairly new. So the students are just completing a multiple choice exercise where they have to match up the verb to the profession in a bit more of a passive way. But as you go along further, you can engage more and more actively with the vocabulary. So I'm going to show you an example of how different types of learners are served by these materials. So here, the verbs are taught visually, and as with the profession words, you can also hear them pronounced on the website. But for the kinesthetic learners, the teacher guide describes something called total physical response or movement activities that can be used in class to reinforce the language being studied. So we're going to take a look at an example of the same vocabulary taught through movement, and I'll show you a video recorded during my summer program with my online summer program students. And as you watch, note the progression of I mentioned this passive reception of vocabulary to active production. So first, I, as the teacher, I'll say a word, and the students have to understand it passively and do the action that I tell them to do. During the next round, the teacher does the action, and the students have to name it. So they are more actively producing the word, but it's still a relatively low stakes production because they're doing it as a whole class. So if I happen to have forgotten one verb, I can sort of count on my classmates remembering it. And finally, in the third phase, each student gives a command to the rest of the class. That's an active individual production by each student. And as you watch, see if you can recognize the verbs that are pictured here in the actions that you see.
Seid ihr so gut, sagt nicht, ja, sagt nicht, tut, ja, fotografiert und verkauft und kocht und näht
I'm going to skip ahead a little bit.
und gießt. Sagt mir, was ich tue. Was tue ich?
Ihr schwimmt.
Ihr schwimmt.
Was tue ich?
Ihr
Ihr
fotografiert.
Was tue ich?
Ihr näht.
Ihr näht.
Ihr gießt.
Ihr gießt.
Was tue ich?
Ihr lang.
Sehr gut. Alles klar?
Ja.
Gut, seid ihr so gut, jetzt ihr werdet sagen und die anderen Menschen wollen tun. Zum Beispiel, Jankev, sei so gut und sagt uns, was zu tun.
Gießt.
Alle, ja?
Alle, alle.
Und Sprinze.
Bestellt.
Gut, und Chaya.
Bakt.
Und Dovber.
Good.
Sehr gut.
Okay, so that was just an example of one way to combine the visual learning with audio learning and kinesthetic learning in the classroom.
Yes.
So now that we've reached a point where the students are comfortable with their new vocabulary and ready to integrate it with structures that they learned earlier in the unit. So in the example of this exercise, again, we have people here pictured practicing their professions, but now that the profession words themselves are fairly comfortable for the students, they are combining them with adjectives, with nominative adjective endings that they learned earlier in this unit. So here we have John. John is an Akteur, ja, und John is an interessanter Akteur. So students are, for each of these images, students are writing a sentence where they are describing the person, and what their profession is with an adjective. John is an interessanter Akteur. There's an element of creativity you can choose which adjective you think fits best. So here, ber is a doctor. So a student might say, ber is a kluger doctor. Yeah, ber is a smart doctor. And once the vocabulary has been mastered, students are ready to begin applying it to their own lives by expressing their opinions about various professions. So in this exercise, we begin with a dialogue, a very short dialogue that includes a number of idiomatic expressions. And these idiomatic expressions are something we call conversation management. They are phrases that allow the students to have a natural conversation with each other and talk about their feelings and their opinions. So in this case, they are responding to a set of prompts like, what profession earns a lot of money? What profession earns very little money? In what profession do you work from 9 to 5? In what profession do you work only in the evenings? And they have to think of a profession for each prompt and discuss it with their partner by using the phrases, ich mein as, I think that. And before they're able to do that on their own, they use this sample dialogue, which appears in written form in the book. And they can also listen to this dialogue on the website. So here it is. And these are all native Yiddish speaker actors who recorded these audio materials.
Ich mein, als een professor fährt auf Konferenzen. Bist Masken?
Ja, ich bin Masken. Und ein Musiker arbeitet in einem Büro?
Nein. Ich bin nicht Masken, weil ein Musiker spielt auf Konzerten. Ein Advokat arbeitet in einem Büro.
Oh, du bist gerecht.
So they're getting both the idiomatic phrases, but also the natural inflection, so that they're not just using kind of rigid textbook sentences and kind of a monotone voice, but learning by example to use idiomatic speech that is inflected in a native way. So once they have learned how to say, I think that, a lawyer works in the office and the other partner can agree or disagree, ich bin maskim, ich bin nicht maskim, they apply this kind of conversation to each of the different prompts. So after this applying of the material to their own personal lives by discussing their opinions, this section contains an authentic text, a Yiddish song called Woje willst du, on the topic of professions. And in this song, a father and a daughter are having a conversation in which they are discussing what kind of romantic partner the girl wants to have based on the profession of the prospective groom. So, sorry, just one moment. This song is both listening comprehension practice, because again, on the website, there is the audio of the song. I'll just play a very short clip.
Woje willst du, a Schneider von a Mann, a Schneider von a Mann.
A Schneider von a Mann will ich nicht, a Schneider sa Tochter bin ich nicht, Kleider nähen kenn ich nicht. Seh ich mir a Stein, setz ich sich und wein. Alle Mädel hoppen, chassene, nur ich bleib allein. Alle Mädel hoppen, chassene, nur ich bleib allein.
So as they listen, they can follow along with the text that's printed in the book. As you can see here, there are blanks that they can fill in to test their listening comprehension abilities. And this song uses the vocabulary that's being studied in a cultural context. So not only are we practicing the profession words like Schneider, we get to see what role professions played in the lives of Yiddish speakers in Eastern Europe. And this song is just one example of the variety of cultural texts that can be found in eynem, texts by a variety of authors representing as broad a chronological and geographic range as possible, including both popular culture and high art in various registers and with various media. There's excerpts from Yiddish film, there's Yiddish radio, prose text, poetry, songs, archival images, and so on and so forth. And these authentic texts allow us not only to learn more about Yiddish culture, but to creatively engage with it. So for instance, in this exercise, after learning the song text, students are asked to write a new stanza using other profession-related words that they know. So in the song itself, you have a Schneider faraman, will ich nicht, I don't want a tailor for a husband, a Schneider za Tochter bin ich nicht, because I'm not a tailor's daughter. It's a formulaic construction that repeats in every stanza. And so the students follow the same formula, but pick a new profession. So someone might say, a journalist faraman will ich nicht. I don't want a journalist for a husband. A journalist a Tochter bin ich nicht. I'm not a journalist's daughter. And the end of each stanza explains what the girl can't do that's related to the profession. So in the original, Kleider nähen kann ich nicht, I don't know how to sew, the student might write, if it's a journalist, Artikeln schreiben kann ich nicht. I don't know how to write articles, so I can't be married to a journalist. So another example of an authentic text that practices listening is this oral history interview with Yiddish actor Vaisman Finkel. So up until now, we've looked at professions pretty broadly, lots of different words to describe lots of different professions and general categories of what people do within the professions. And here we are focusing in on a specific profession in more detail, the profession of an actor. And it's an opportunity for students to immerse deeper in topics that are of interest to them. And in addition, the clip in the book itself is a fairly short clip from the oral history interview. But whenever we have any excerpt of any kind of text in the book, we always provide links to the full text on the textbook website. So if someone becomes interested in a particular topic, let's say they think Vaisman Finkel is fascinating, as he is, and they're not satisfied with just the short clip, they can always find the full-length interview linked from the exercise. So I'll just show you what that looks like. So here is the short clip that we show. It's only 51 seconds.
Du sie gewähnt ein Akteur. Du sie gewähnt ein Komiker. Du sie gewähnt ein tragischer Akteur.
And we work with what he says in this clip. And then if you're interested, you can click on this link for full interview, and you will see the entire, hour and a half long interview that you can watch on your own if a particular topic interests you. And I'll show an example later of the same kind of thing with a literary text, a poem as well. Listening to Yiddish speakers, as in this example, allows students to be exposed to also a variety of dialects and variants of Yiddish, which is an important skill for them to build on as they engage with real Yiddish materials outside of class. So while the book itself primarily teaches standard Yiddish, we demonstrate a lot of authentic texts, both in writing with different orthographies and in audio with different Yiddish dialects, for the students to start getting used to the different types of Yiddish that they will encounter outside of the classroom. So to conclude this section, I'd like to talk about one more exercise in this chapter, which is an excerpt of a poem by Moshe Nadir called Mein Mishpacha. And here you see the textbook exercise with the poem text written out here. So this exercise appears in the review section of the chapter that we've been looking at, because it consolidates a few of the topics that are covered in the chapter. It uses both family vocabulary and profession vocabulary. So the review sections are cumulative. They combine multiple topics that have been covered thus far. I'd like to highlight a few features of this exercise. So first of all, as you can see here, texts are presented with marginal glosses. It's a bit small on your screen, I think, but in this right-hand column are translations of keywords in the Yiddish that students need for comprehension. So we don't provide translations of every word because that would be overwhelming. And it's also, not necessary and not really reflective of kind of natural language learning. We provide just the keywords that are crucial to getting the context of the poem. And the translations are always in the margin of the text itself for ease of comprehension. Students don't have to flip back and forth between the text and a long vocabulary list and try to search for the word in the list. And by that time, they've already forgotten where it was in the sentence and what they were trying to read. So this way, it's kind of instant gratification of knowing what the word means. And as I mentioned before, with this text, we are also exposing students to different orthographies, because this poem was initially published in Soviet orthography, which is a writing system in which words of Hebrew origin are spelled phonetically, the way that they are pronounced, instead of with their original Hebrew spelling as in standard Yiddish. So while in the book itself, we have standardized the spelling. So here you'll see mishpacha, for example, spelled as it is in Hebrew. When you go to the website and you look at the text provided there, you have the original poem as it was printed in the book that it comes from. And here already you see mishpacha in Soviet orthography with all of the extra vowels, mein mishpacha. And again, if a student likes this poem by Moshe Nadir and wants to read more of Moshe Nadir's works, they click on this view the full source text on the website, and they are taken to the whole book of Moshe Nadir's poetry. And once they've read mein mishpacha, they can flip the page and read additional poems. So that is a sampling of the kinds of exercises that you can find in the book. I also wanted to let you know, in case you would like to know how you could get your own copy of the book, there is this link that you can follow. I will also put it in the chat. And you can email me as well if you have any additional questions. But now I think we have a fair amount of time for any questions that folks might have here. And I think you're welcome to raise your virtual hand or your real hand, and we can try to spot you in the gallery. And you can also put your questions in the chat. So I see a question, I think, from Janice. You want to go ahead and unmute yourself?
Yeah, there we go. Hi. It's wonderful to get to hear you explain your book. I've been teaching a class with your book for over a year, but I had a question. And we designed our meetings and time according to the needs of our students. But in an ideal situation, like if I ever start a new group of beginners, what do you think is the optimum in terms of numbers of days per week and hours per class?
That's an excellent question. I think that really depends on your student body and what their availability is, because people have other commitments and other things going on. And especially if you're teaching online, there's, have to factor in Zoom fatigue. But generally for a language class, frequency is always better than length of time. So if you can have shorter classes that meet more often, that will help with the learning process more than having, 2-hour classes once a month or something like that. So that would be one recommendation. And just one other thing that I'll note is that one of the things that was really important to us in building this book was that it's a bit of a choose your own adventure aspect to it. So there are lots and lots of material. There's lots and lots of material there, but you don't necessarily have to go through all of it, or you can, depending on what your benchmarks are and where you're trying to get to by the end of your class. So there are ways to kind of skip around and choose only certain authentic texts, for example, or really go in depth within every section. But if, for example, you have a class that meets less frequently, and you want to make sure you cover, a certain amount of material, there are ways that you can cover, do just kind of the core exercises and get through, the main topics, and then come back to some of the supplementary materials as time allows. And this is also the case for independent learners who might not have a specific deadline. They could really spend more time on the supplementary materials. Does that answer your question?
I'm going to try to pin you down a little more. Let's say this were being offered at a college for credit. Would it be 3 days a week, an hour each, or 2 days a week, hour and a half, or what?
Yes. I mean, I think if that is a possibility, that is a very good model, 3 days a week for an hour, if you can manage that. Again, different colleges have different schedules for elective courses. But so when we use the book at the Yiddish Book Center, our classes meet twice a week for, I forget now, I think it's an hour and a half twice a week with 6-week sessions. But if you can make it even more frequent, that's great as well.
Okay. Asya and Dan. We
Adank.
love the book. We love the book.
Adank.
We love you.
Thank you. Miri.
Hi, Asya and Shukoyach on this beautiful book.
Thank you.
So I have a very practical question for you. So I purchased the book, but I have been teaching using Sheva Zucker's text for 22 years. So I cannot, just transition from one to the other. But there are obviously aspects of your book that I would love to introduce into the classroom. But if, all the students have bought Sheva Zucker's book, right? We've been using that. So what's the best way that I can do that? That I can, let's say, borrow from 1 or 2 of the exercises or the readings, or use something from the website, or,
That's an interesting
transition. Yeah.
So you, as the teacher, have access to the online materials, which includes, for example, projections of all of the artwork. So if you're not assigning homework from eynem, the physical book is really important for students to be able to do homework and study on their own. But if you're not assigning homework from eynem and just want to use a couple of exercises in class, then basically the whole thing really just relies on the artwork. So if you project those images and follow the suggested lesson plans from the teacher guide, you can supplement other curricula with materials from the book that way. But our recommendations are mostly in the teacher guide itself for how to use the materials, even if they are individual portions rather than the full curriculum. So I would just take a look at that. And if there's a section that you're currently working on about professions, for example, as that was the example I just gave, the art is there to support that vocabulary set. Thank you for that question. Judith has a hand raised.
Maybe I missed this, but how, if you use that book, how far does it go? Is it just for beginners, or does it go, or what?
That's an excellent question. Yes, it's a very good question that I didn't really fully mention. When we initially wrote it, our intention was that it would cover the equivalent of a year of a college course. As we started using it, we discovered that there's quite a bit more in there than can be covered in a single year. So as I was saying before, if you kind of just focus on the core curriculum and skip over the supplementary exercises, you can get through most of 5 units, maybe 4.5 units in a year-long college course. And then, the further in depth you go, it could be stretched over 2 years or longer. But the whole idea of levels is something that I'm actually really interested in right now, and I'm exploring. And I think our ideas about what a beginner is or what an intermediate is doesn't always line up in Yiddish classes with, for example, the American Council on the Teaching of Foreign Languages, which has certain proficiency guidelines for what it means to be a novice speaker, an intermediate speaker, and so forth. I think if we're not trying to rush into things like making sure we've fully covered all of the tenses by a certain level, then this book could easily be used over 2 years, for example. And I think this actually segues into a question that showed up in the chat, which is, are we preparing a more advanced edition? And I assume you mean a more advanced level, Ellen. So we are actually working on intermediate materials. First of all, there are 2 whole units that we've already drafted that didn't make it into the book because the book is already 2 volumes and very heavy. And if we added 2 more units to it, it just would be not possible to carry it around. But eventually we plan on finishing editing those units and posting them online. And this is part of a larger plan to create an online intermediate curriculum for Yiddish that will be modular. And we're working on this project with Rivka Margolis, who is currently in Australia, but also at the University of Ottawa, and is a master intermediate teacher. And so we're going to have a website with different modules that intermediate teachers can pick and choose from, depending on the interests of their particular class and their particular students. So this is more of a long-term plan for us.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for these 2 questions.
Okay.
There was also a question, is there Cyrillic or Latin writing support? I think that maybe this is a question about the Aleph base and how learning the Aleph base in conjunction with this book. So the book actually, the way that we approach the Aleph base is that we have a crash course at the beginning on really focused and intensive Aleph-based learning, so that by the time you get to chapter 1, you're expected to already be familiar with basic reading and writing from having completed the Aleph-based chapter. And the rest of the book is in Yiddish characters. We don't use any transliteration anywhere in the book. Because, part of the methodology of this course is the idea that if you really focus and spend some time with the letters, you can master them and then use Yiddish. For example, you would never take a Russian class that used transliteration into Roman characters. You would learn Cyrillic and then learn Russian with Cyrillic. So we use the same approach for Yiddish. Just going to see if there were any other questions that I missed in the chat. What are the societal characteristics of families who send their children to Yiddish classes? That's a very interesting question. I'm not sure I understand. So our students, who are the kind of the target students of our book, are mostly adults. So college students and beyond, although the book could easily be used in high school classes as well and has been used with teenagers. And in fact, we have one teacher in Montreal who is using the book in elementary school. So she's adapting the materials quite a bit. And her class, unfortunately, meets fairly infrequently, but she is using the curriculum in an adapted way with second and third graders. But I would say the vast majority of the people using the book are high school, college, and above. And it's all kinds of people. I mean, really, when I was talking about the cast of characters earlier, those are the same types of people who are studying Yiddish today. How does one help students with correct enunciation and or pronunciation to improve confidence in their speaking abilities? So my answer to improving your pronunciation is a lot of listening. Making sure to listen as much as possible to Yiddish speakers and to, both live Yiddish speakers and audio of Yiddish speakers. And eventually, the pronunciation you will be able to incorporate it into your own kind of language map in your brain, and it will improve over time. And also practice, listening and speaking is what helps with that. I think that was all of the questions in the chat. We have a couple of more minutes if anybody has any other questions that they'd like to ask. I saw a hand. It says Arnold, but I think it's, if you'd like to unmute yourself. You're still muted. Here.
Hello.
Hi.
Okay. Anna Leodesky. Sorry, my husband signed me up because I'm not technical, very technical.
No problem.
I'm from Minneapolis, Minnesota area. And I taught public school for 40 years, public school. So I'm a Bobby, and my girlfriend, Bobby Goldfarb, she's another Bobby. Her granddaughter came to us and said, we want to start a Yiddish club after school. This was a couple of years ago before the pandemic. We went to Hopkins High School, which has 1,200 students or something like that. We had to seek permission from the school system to go in. And we had an after-school club. And the kids came to us for half hour to 45 minutes, which isn't very long because some had soccer, basketball, volleyball, et cetera, et cetera. But these kids showed up each week. And being that I was a K-3 teacher, we were early childhood teachers. So we started very minutely because in Minneapolis, the focus is not on Yiddish. The focus is on Hebrew school, Talmud Torah, which I went to. And it was a hard transition. I only learned like kitchen Yiddish from my mother and my Bobby. So we gave them the same kind of Yiddish that we grew up with. Family members' names, easy sentences, rote learning, repetition, sat in a circle. And each week they came in and said, my nomen is Hanalea, and das is Basya. And Basya would say, my nomen is Basya, and das is David, et cetera, et cetera. We went around the circle each week and we said that. Then we gave them family names, the mother, the father, the Bobby, the Zadie, and we gave them enough to make their grandparents have a little bit of nachas. We gave them sentences, and I said, I want you to, the homework was to talk to their Bobbies and Zadies and their parents, but to talk to their Bobbies and Zadies. And it really took off and went well. And as an early childhood teacher, numbers, 1, 2, 3, 4, Menschen klappen auf der Tür, 5, 6, 7, 8, Menschen lachen in the Nacht, 9, 10, the big fat hen, noch einmal again. And then they'd go, and every time they wanted to come in, 1, 2, 3, 4, Menschen klappen auf der Tür. And I just made that up, and we did it. So we had fun with Yiddish. And we got a lot of good feedback, for
That's
those
wonderful. How many students would come?
12 to 15
That's amazing.
boys and girls. And some of them work summers at Herzl Camp. Some of them for Camp Ramah, but that's Hebrew. That's not Yiddish. If you've heard of these camps, you know.
Yes.
And some of them have gone, well, maybe go to Israel on their birthright and things like that. But Bobby and I still talk a bissel Yiddish, and we meet with our Yiddish group on Zoom now. People want to meet in person, but
yes.
Dorothy Martin and I co-chair a Yiddish Winkel, a Yiddish group here. But it was fun to work with kids that want to know Yiddish. And my grandson just took a class, not in Yiddish, but about Jews at the University of Minnesota. So that's the Bobby's influence in our home here in the Twin Cities.
That's wonderful. Well, thank you so much for sharing that.
And thank you for your book. Thank you for
thank
your
you.
book. I try to get my hands on that book.
So speaking of that, I did put the links in the chat. So if you want to take a look in the chat, it's my email address. And it is a URL that you can click on that has more information about the textbook, as well as ordering information. So if you're interested, you can find that in the chat. And Shenem Dank, thank you all for coming. I want to make sure we have a few minutes break before our next session. I hope you will all stick around. We're going to have an awards ceremony at 6 o'clock, followed by a showing of my mother's animated Yiddish films, which will be led by Kole Baradulin, whom I see here in the room with us now.